Let's begin by pivoting off of the school finance lawsuit, since that's the most immediate thing on people's minds. We're sort of in halftime, maybe that's the right way to say it, of this lawsuit. Judge Dietz having handed down his decision. We're waiting now to see how the Supreme Court decision goes. Let me start with the two people who are most involved in this case, Mr. Thompson and Chairman Grusendorf. Mr. Thompson, from your perspective, I guess you're right, say on the winning side up to this point, would you talk about what you intended to accomplish by getting in that lawsuit and how you interpret, briefly, but let's do substance here, how you interpret Judge Dietz's ruling and what you anticipate is going to happen on the lawsuit next?
What we hope to accomplish is exactly what our Constitution has required since 1876. And that is not only that we establish a system of public free schools, but that we suitably provide for that system so that all of our children are able to meet the high standards that we set for all of our kids in Texas. Our group represents over 1.8 million kids. That's the largest group of children that have ever been represented in any of these lawsuits, and it's a very diverse group. Our group has both Chapter 41 districts and Chapter 42 districts.
Explain, please, for the benefit of the audience,
a Chapter 42 district is, I would say generally it's average funding or lower, and it's very dependent on the state funding formulas. Right. It is not a recapture district. Chapter 41 is a provision of our education code that is shorthand for the wealthier districts in the state that may even have so much revenue that they have to give some back
from
to the
whom we
state
take revenue and
in the form of recapture. And recapture total in Texas right now is about $1 billion a year of local property taxes that get sent back to the state.
So you went in saying inadequate, inequitable, and unconstitutional.
Our position is we have an inadequate system because it doesn't fund the standards that we're setting for all kids.
Right.
Our position is it's inequitable because we don't equitably lift all districts to those standards, provide revenue necessary to meet the standards. We believe the system is arbitrary, and I can say more about that in a bit. And we also believe that once again, as in 2005, we've backed into a local property tax, a state property tax. When the state gets so dependent on local property taxes as the primary basis to support public schools, that a local property tax operates as if it were a state revenue source, a state property tax. Our Supreme Court has fairly commonsensically said for many years, if it looks and operates like a state property tax, we're going to call it a state property
So Judge Dietz's ruling essentially affirmed all of the points you
Judge Dietz, this was the most sweeping ruling in any of the rulings going back to Edgewood 1. Judge Dietz found the system unconstitutional on all grounds.
Okay. Now, Mr. Chairman, your group, TREE, I guess we can call it TREE by short, although there's an extra E, TREE was a party to this lawsuit, but not in the same way that the group Mr. Thompson represented was a party. Can you talk about that and what you attempted to accomplish by way of your participation in the suit?
Well, our intent was to represent all 5 million students in the state of Texas, actually from a school student perspective as opposed to school district establishment perspective in the fight between the haves and the have-nots in the school system. And our lawsuit is really based on the core constitutional requirement of efficiency. The Texas Constitution calls for an efficient system of public free schools. And the Texas Supreme Court has said that efficiency is an explicit constitutional requirement, whereas the constitutional requirements that David Thompson has litigated on, adequacy and equity, the Texas Supreme Court has said that those are only implicit constitutional requirements. So we've gone to the core of the constitutional issue that the system must be efficient. Also, if I can back up just a second, Evan, Judge Dietz has not actually ruled. Judge Dietz has indicated verbally from the bench what he intends to rule.
We haven't seen papers yet.
But he has not issued a written ruling. And until we see that written ruling, we don't really know the details of his ruling.
You have any reason to think that our interpretation of his ruling based on what he has said will differ from what we actually see in in paper?
No, I think he's going to rule basically what he said, but there's a lot of nuances
Of
to
course.
that. I think he will do exactly what he said he would do.
Right.
But there, like I said, there's a lot of detail in that we have not seen. Until we see that written ruling, we really don't know where we're going.
Tell us quickly, how is the perception of your group, how is the state not living up to the efficiency standard? And what was the basis for your decision to get involved in this legally?
Well, we're probably the only party to the lawsuit that received a written invitation from the Texas Supreme Court to intervene in this lawsuit. In the West Orange Court case, the Supreme Court said that perhaps the system could be made more efficient through competition and not wasting so much money. But that issue has not been before the court, and so therefore we can't rule on it at this time. So basically in West Orange, they put this invitation out there that somebody needs to bring the issue of true efficiency before the Supreme Court. And like I said, the court has said previously that efficiency is an explicit requirement of the Constitution, whereas the adequacy and equity. So we're going to win this lawsuit. I think we're in the best position of anybody. I know David differs with that.
Well,
he tried real hard to get us out of it because he differed with it.
Kent,
But-
we made no effort whatsoever to get you out of the lawsuit, and I want you to correct your statement on that regard. We made no opposition.
Didn't you sign on to that filing
Absolutely
at the
not.
end?
No.
I'm sorry then, I
And so
apologize.
let's get our facts
all the
straight.
other school folks signed on to a petition to try to get us out of the lawsuit.
We
I
did
thought
not.
David did too.
No.
Mr. Chairman, so Judge Dietz's verbal decision, we don't have the actual ruling, as you correctly point out, found for Mr. Thompson's side, but in your case, Judge Dietz, if I understand correctly, said this is really a matter for the legislature to address, not the courts.
That's what he said verbally.
And you are hoping that the Supreme Court sees this differently.
I think the Supreme Court will definitely see that different, because if they said adequacy and equity are implicit and efficiency
Then why
is
would-
explicit,
Yeah.
then they're basically saying efficiency is a higher standard, and basically equity and adequacy are components of efficiency. They're only components
Right.
to the efficiency argument.
Mr. Chairman, you get to be a spectator to this, even though you've been so deeply involved in public education for so many years from the legislature side, legislative perspective. What is your sense of this battle going on here and of Judge Dietz's ruling, and where do you think this goes now?
Well, I've always, here we go. I've always been a fan of being able to sing in the choir. No, I've always been a fan of efficiency, because I've seen the trends for how we spend our money on schools, on education, and the way we've been doing that, we've not been getting the results that most people would expect when they put more money into something. Now, you know, there are other factors, but efficiency is something that we're going to have to be very aware of in the future, because when you look at competing requirements for funding, look at transportation. I mean, we're in debt trying to build roads. Health and Human Services, that's a big battle. In fact, that's your big story next month.
Yeah.
And pensions. So there's not going to be a whole lot of government money to go around. So I've been interested in the efficiency aspect of, you know, what school districts are getting more for their dollars spent than others. And there are some good measures of that, and that's something I've been very interested in.
Your sense going into this case, we'll come to Mr. Thompson in a second. Your sense going into this case, Mr. Chairman, is you did not believe that the state system of funding public education was unconstitutional. You did not, or you did?
Well, in certain aspects, I've seen, for example, I gave a deposition in the lawsuit.
In support of?
Well, in the efficiency aspect,
Yeah,
and,
right.
and my job was to talk about how the legislative process adds to the inefficiency of the system.
Of course, that process was in your hands for several sessions.
As much as it is in anybody.
Right.
Well,
Well,
thank you,
so
thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
You're right. In as much, and it's funny, they say, Rob, how do you like lobbying? I said, I've always been lobbying, because when you have a public ed bill
Even internally you lobby.
You are lobbying everybody.
Right, but
You're always selling.
So you believe that the system was unconstitutional?
The system per se, I'll have to say there are aspects of it that continue to make it worse, okay? Because the school funding formulas do exactly what they're intended to do. It's an algebra problem.
Let me give Mr. Hochberg a quick
And
in
then I
here
wanna
before we come
comment.
right back to you,
Yeah.
Mr. Thompson. Is the system unconstitutional, Scott?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think the court and Kent talks about clear indications from the court.
Yeah.
I think the court has said on a number of occasions, first of all, that districts that are similarly situated with similar tax rates ought to have similar revenues per comparable student.
Right.
We've gotten so out of whack on that it's not even predictable anymore. We talked about Chapter 41 and Chapter 42 districts. Even those definitions have become meaningless. It
Yeah.
looks like I was in D.C. and I happened to walk into the National Museum of Art, and there was Jackson Pollock stuff on the wall, and I said, "Wow, school finance," because it was this random scattering of dots.
Yeah.
And it looks just like how our school finance system works today.
Right.
So we're out of whack there. And when you have districts that adjoin each other, that are competing in the same labor market, and one has significantly more money than the other per student or per same student,
Yeah.
then you've created an adequacy problem, at least for the district that's on the low end.
Yeah.
And no matter how much money you put in or how much you take out, you've still got that problem if this guy has $30,000, $40,000 more dollars per classroom than the one sitting next to it.
What about the efficiency argument you've heard Chairman Eisler and Chairman Grusendorf make? Is there any merit to the efficiency argument?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I've never seen in the court rulings that I've read where efficiency in that context
Yeah.
was used. Efficiency has been determined, as Kent said, in terms of the financial efficiency of whether the tax collection and distribution system is efficient.
But if I understand Mr. Grusendorf's group's point here, it's that we have a bloated bureaucracy, we have a lot of regulation that may not be necessary. We're not running a streamlined operation that will produce ultimately the best results. Is that a fair
Absolutely.
statement? Do you-
And Rob can speak to this better than I can in the amount of increase in funding over the last decade or so that we've put into it and how those results relate to the.
Right.
But I think, and back to Scott's point on equity, I sat through the 14 weeks of the trial, and quite honestly, I think the plaintiffs have a better case on equity than they do on adequacy.
adequacy.
But in truth of the matter, and we had witnesses testify to this, should we really be talking about equity for school districts? Because that's what all the litigation is about. Or should we be talking about equity for students? That's what we need to be talking about, in my opinion.
How is
That's
that different, Mr. Grusendorf?
Well, if you just talk about trying to level the playing field for various bureaucracies, what are you doing for those kids? And we need to focus on the results of the kids. And we had several witnesses testify that, hey, if you want real equity, give every kid a voucher or credit or some kind of scholarship program. Allow them to go to the best school to meet their needs. So if we're going to really talk about equity, why don't we talk about equity for kids, not just equity for school districts?
Mr. Horton, do you have any?
I've got to jump in on this. First of all, I think every one of us supports equity, hopefully. Hopefully, every one of us supports adequacy in the sense of we provide what's necessary to actually meet the standards we're setting.
Right.
And every one of us supports efficiency. This notion, Evan, before we get further, that there's the efficiency argument that's somehow distinct from the other argument
Disaggregated
is
from
really
the other.
silly. I think every school in Texas works very hard to make the best use we can of the dollars that are available.
Right.
And I'm going to tell you, the data is absolutely clear that in Texas, we get above average results for below average expenditures. That's not the issue. The issue is whether we're getting what we need to reach the high standards we've set for every kid. And I will go back, Ken, to something you just said about equity for students. Because I think we've all known each other. I've known every one of y'all before you were in the legislature. Rob, I represented you when you were on a local school board. And I've known you during your entire service and since you've been out of the legislature. But I want to ask you a question. 60% of our kids in Texas schools come from low-income homes. And that is increasing by about 1% a year. Virtually any analysis you do is going to tell you that's your best proxy It correlates to educational performance because it's a measure, it's a proxy for stability of the home and educational level in the home, particularly educational level of the mother. 60% of our kids are low income. Now here's the question I want to ask you and I want to ask our audience. As a district, as the percentage of low income kids increases in a district, does the job get harder or easier? Is it harder to have 25% low income kids or 75% low income kids in your district?
So let's stipulate that it's harder.
Let me finish
right?
the
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
It's harder. So do you think as the percentage of low income kids goes up in a district, you ought to get more money or less money?
What do
The
you
job's
say?
getting harder. Should you get more money or less money as you go to 60, 70, 80, 90% of your kids being low income?
Yeah.
I want to tell you what the analysis is.
Thank you.
Kent,
Thank you
let
for
me
that
finish.
soft-
Let me finish this.
Oh, okay.
The analysis indicates, let me get the fact out and then we can debate it. In Texas today, and I think every one of us probably wouldn't intentionally design a system this way, but it's a fact about our system. As the percentage of low-income kids increases in school districts, the revenue available per weighted student declines in a straight line. You get less money per weighted student in Texas as the number of harder to educate or more needy kids increases. That is a definition of an unsuitable system. It is not structured, funded, or operated to meet its purpose for all kids.
Let me let Chairman Grisendorf.
That is a fundamental flaw in our system that until we deal with that, we're going to have an unconstitutional system.
Chairman Eisler is saying that that is not true. The premise of
It's
Mr. Thompson's
absolutely
question
true.
is not true. Do you-
I think the premise is flawed, but let me first of all say, in our lawsuit, we didn't debate the issue of adequacy. We did not really challenge the plaintiff attorneys on their more money, although all the school superintendents testified, basically give us more money and hold us less accountable. We really
That's
didn't
not
get into
true.
that. It's basically true. If you
Let's-
read the
let's
transcript.
let him
but
have
let's-
his- let him have his
but-
moment.
But I think you gave me a softball question there on the money and the disadvantaged kids, because if you remember in the testimony, we had Yes Prep Academy testified before the court. And Yes Prep has about, I think if I remember right, about 70% economically disadvantaged students. 100% of their students are college ready, and they spend about $500 less per child than the typical public schools. And if we had virtually every school superintendent tell us that they were not producing college-ready students and that they didn't have enough money, and if they had more money, that would solve the problem. Yes Prep is doing it at less money and very efficiently. Why don't we look at the types of things, and quite honestly, David has testified for years for more deregulation. We took the approach,
Yep.
we need to deregulate our public schools, give them the flexibility that our charter schools have, and allow them to do a better job. Of course, the unions fight that tooth and toenail, but there's a lot of inefficiency in our labor laws, and we talked about that in the lawsuit. When you have a law in place that prohibits a principal or a school superintendent from firing the duds, the system is inefficient, folks. How can any rational human being say that's an efficient system? But that's what we do on our laws. We put all these rules and regulations. We tie school superintendents' hands behind their back, and we expect them to do a good job. So right now, the only solution, so long as you leave their hands tied behind their back, you got to get them more money. But you've got to go to the core of the issue and redesign the system, allow it to be efficient.
Vice Chairman Hoffman.
I've got to go back to Yes Prep. And I love the work that Yes Prep does, but I have to correct the data. And they're in my district. I'm very familiar with them. They've been in my district, the district I used to represent.
Old habits, blah, blah, blah.
I still
get
love
that.
them.
That's fine.
And I still live there. But that statistic is clearly wrong, and here's why.
That's
Which-
what
which-
they
which
testified to,
which
Scott.
statistic? Which one?
The
All I'm
statistic
doing
that
is quoting the trial
I understand,
testimony.
and I've heard it before, and it's an argument that gets made for exactly this same reason and is used in these kinds of discussions. 100% of Yes Prep kids who graduate from Yes Prep may in fact be college ready. But guess what? There's a pretty significant attrition rate between being a freshman at a Yes Prep high school and being a senior at a Yes Prep high school. They are not dropouts under the state definition, because when they leave, they go back to Lee High School or Sharpstown High School or any of those other high schools, and they don't show up as dropouts. So they have a 0 dropout and 100% college readiness, but nowhere near all the kids who come in are the same kids who go out.
Are there any public schools that are doing that good a job?
Yes, and I respect the work, and I respect the work that Yes does, and I respect the work that Harmony does, and that KIP does, and they're all in my area in Southwest Houston. But that kind of number distorts the conversation. There are no magic bullets. And the second half of that is the money they're spending. Because while I think the number you're quoting from what I've seen may be state funding.
$500 less per student
Maybe.
than state funding.
Maybe.
They said it was total
Maybe.
funding.
They said it was total money?
It includes what he's comparing it to.
Compares to
includes
facilities, but
on the
does not-
operating side, they're
but
slightly above average.
But does not include the amount of money that they raise externally,
Correct.
which is substantial.
That's
And
one of the
again,
big
I
differences.
bless their hearts for it.
Right.
They do a great job.
Chairman.
And you look at spending, okay? And David, the more free and reduced lunch kids you have, that's what we base our comp ed on, which is 20% more than the basic allotment. It's at 0.2, and then language learners are at 0.1. So it's at least 20% more than a well-to-do student, because we spend more. We have increased the spending on the gaps, and they have increased over the last 5 years.
You heard Mr. Thompson say that the line goes down as you
I
get
can
more
show you.
kids.
As your percentage of low-income
You shook your
kids
head and said that's not true.
increases,
No, I've not
your
seen
money
that.
goes down.
No.
Absolutely true.
No.
Yep.
Because those are typically
Actually, you
42
can make the
districts that
argument
are poor, right?
The what
You know,
now?
You
to
still
be
have
fair,
offset
Evan,
balance.
Yeah.
there was mixed testimony on that in the trial. We had testimony to the contrary, and David's pointing to the testimony he likes, but,
But you think that there's evidence
it's
in
a
the
fact.
contrary.
The formulas are 0.2.
Well,
And Rob, the last
Rob?
time you looked at the weights was before you were in the
Okay.
legislature.
Rob, you're
Let me
right.
let-
You're
These
right
are
that
20 and 25 years old.
Well, I know the
you're,
weights.
Rob, you're right that the formula says 0.2, but that's 0.2 times a
The
basic
basic
number.
allotment.
And the
Before we-
basic allotment is all over the park because of the disequities in
It's
the
lower
in the
to
basic
start with.
system.
we're a
So
little
that
bit down
makes
in
more
we're a
than
little bit
makes
down
sense.
in the
We're in the
weeds.
weeds.
We're a little bit
Yeah.
in the weeds. I'd like to get out the mower here, okay?
We went from 32.18 to 47.65.
Let me take this conversation back up to a level where everybody can see it, and get to this question of that per student spending number, because again, you all are talking about per
Right.
student spending. Is yes
But
spending
if-
less?
If the amount of money spent per child would make education better, we would have solved that a long time ago.
And let's go
in the last-
right there.
In the last 40 years, and this is from Stretching the School Dollar, it's a book by anyway, it doesn't matter. We have.
Good old
we-
what's his name?
Well, I'll think of it and then I'll fix your wagon. We've tripled what we spend on public education in the last 40 years with no appreciable gain.
Well,
in
let's
SATs
get right to
or-
that. So the what I referred to in the introduction of this, Mr. Chairman, was that we are now spending $8,400.
And we have school districts, that spend considerably less with high
With better
percentage-
performance.
With much better performance.
So-
And I'll give you some examples.
Go there in a second. So
All right, I'll go there in a
8,400. So
second.
people understand this. It's $8,400 per enrolled public school student is, according to this most recent survey, what Texas is spending. National average is $11,500 per student. So we are spending,
Well,
according to this,
That's not right
wait,
either.
wait.
you can jump on this, but let me get the
You're not
numbers out,
including
and then
facilities.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the study that just came out that
52.
compared the state of Texas to the other 49 states plus D.C. And it showed, you guys can pick at this, it showed $8,400 per enrolled public school student versus an average of $11,500 nationally. That put us $3,100 below. We were 41st in per student spending prior to the 2011 session. It says that we are 49th now. Now, have at that. Go ahead. What don't you like about those stats? I mean, I'm more than happy to have you challenge them. They're not my stats. I don't take it personally, but go ahead. What's wrong with What's wrong with those stats?
Well, they don't include what we spend on facilities. For example, in the last 5 years, our debt service has gone up like 40%.
Right.
Just because we're building a lot
So
more
where do you
schools.
think, Mr.
So
Chairman,
we're
we fit?
spending-
If you make the true up the numbers, then where are we nationally?
Well, 52 billion divided by 5 million is about 10.4 per student.
And do you know where
Okay?
that would, if
But-
you true up
but
the other
spending-
states, where would that put us compared to the other states?
Well, they're probably not growing as fast as we are. And why does where you rank on school spending an indicator of, number one, how much you care about it, or how well you're doing?
I just
As
think it's an
example,
indicator of how much you spend. I don't think it's anything more than that.
As an example, if you look at the quality count survey, it looked at 4 factors. It looked educational level of the parents, the poverty level, the employment, and the language. Okay,
Yeah.
those 4 areas, and ranked the NAEP scores with all the rest. Number 1 in raw scores was Massachusetts. Okay, and in performance above starting point, because Texas was in those 4 areas like 47th on. We're number 4 in the country in corrected for demographics against our starting point.
I wanna get-
So
So where
Texas
we go-
does well. Texas does very well. But the amount of money you spend does not indicate, well, gee, you spend a whole lot of money. Highland Park is not the best school district for what it.
If money mattered, that's what it would be.
So
Yeah.
I'm confused because he's arguing that the schools stink and he's arguing that they're very good, and I'm not quite sure which side of the
What that-
Chairman, I want to give you a crack at both the statistics, which you seem to have an issue with, and also the general point that somehow there's a correlation, because I know you, and then we'll let Mr. Hochberg and Mr. Thompson in on that. Go ahead.
Well, where do I start here?
Well, what's wrong with, for one thing, what's wrong with the stats? What's wrong with the stats?
There's so much data here. First of all, your $8,400 didn't include facilities, and if you have you've got to look at total spending to compare to me. That makes sense. But I'm gonna come back to the point. I don't really care. I'm willing to give the schools more money. What I'm wanting to do, what I'm focusing on, is let's spend that money wisely. Let's make sense. Let's do it in a way that actually promotes student achievement and doesn't just feed a bureaucracy. We're really doing some things in the state of Texas pretty stupidly. And until we get a handle on those things and make some changes, there's never going to be enough money, folks, to feed the beast or to fill the black hole. So you've got to make some structural changes, and then, okay, you can fight about the money. I really hate to get into this argument on money, but we spend about $11,000 per kid in the state of Texas when you consider facilities, TRS, when you look at total spending per student. On the performance, we had a lot of mixed testimony on the trial. Eric Hanishak is probably the leading economist in the nation on school finance. He was one of our expert witnesses in the trial. He did graphs all through the state of Texas, looking at various school districts, looking at their demographics, looking at what they spend, and looking at student actually raw test scores. Didn't find a correlation. Some of the other experts found, the state experts did not find a correlation with spending. Now you can, like you say, statistics, you can do anything with them you want. So they had experts testify that, yeah, there's correlation. David is right that they all found that the economically disadvantaged kids do require more. So that part is right. But to find a direct correlation between spending and results, at best, it was a mixed bag in the testimony. Again, that's not my case. I'm willing to spend more money.
Right.
I want results for 5 million kids.
But
not just the kids David represents, not just the districts or the kids that in districts that the equity lawsuit represent. I want equity and accountability and performance for 5 million kids in the state of Texas, because we as Texas taxpayers, that's what we're paying for, and that's what we ought to demand.
You quarreled, Mr. Grusendorf, in the introduction of this program with the TEA statistics that I cited, that when you looked at based on, I don't know if you may know, Scott, if it was 2010 or 2011, the rankings of
Doesn't matter.
schools.
Any
that-
year.
Yeah, that the exemplary schools spent on average $1,000 per student more than the unacceptable schools. You quarrel with that. I want to give you an opportunity to tell me why I'm wrong.
Well,
Stick it up my nose. Why is that?
It's meaning, I think Scott's the first one that came out with that analysis. That's a meaningless number. You've got to look at student
I thought you were
performance.
going to compliment me on it, Ken. I'm so disappointed.
I mean, go ahead.
Well, no,
No, no,
please.
no,
I mean,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
I do want to know why you think
Why-
that's
tell me
why
why
is
you
that a
think it's a bad
meaningless
number.
statistic? I'd like to hear that.
Because you're ranking, okay, what does exemplary mean in the state of Texas?
90%.
What does recognized mean in the state of Texas? If you're going to try to make a correlation between dollars and student performance, the only rational way to do it is to base it on raw student scores. Then you can adjust it for demographic differences if you choose to, and which a lot of experts did, and which I think is rational and reasonable. But when you just use your state classifications, it tells you absolutely nothing about the correlation between performance and money.
So we should not have confidence, Mr. Chairman, in the TEA's
Well, that-
assessment of performance?
TEA actually put up data